Hi there. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, whatever time it is. As always, happy whatever day it is. Welcome to Left Side of the Aisle. I'm your host. My name's Larry Erickson. For the next roughly half hour, I'm going to be rattling on about things that I think are important enough for you to take note of. If you have any reactions to the show, you can email them to me directly. My personal email is whoviating, WHOVIATING at AOL.com. And if you didn't catch that, you can go to my website, Lotus Surviving a Dark Time, and the URL will be over here a couple of times during the show. You can get the email address from there, or you can leave a comment there if you'd like. If you do send me email, as always, 2 requests. Include something in the subject line to make it clear this is not spam, and be a little patient about getting an answer because I'm really, really bad about answering email. So, with that, I managed to find one bit of good news this week. On July 20th, the Cuban flag was hoisted in front of a building in Washington, D.C., symbolically marking that site's shift from the limited role of interest section to the role of full-fledged embassy. Just hours before, at the stroke of midnight, the U.S. and Cuba resumed full diplomatic relations for the first time in over 50 years. Each nation's interest section responded immediately by changing its status to embassy, and fittingly for the Times, the Cubans did it on their Twitter account, and the Americans did it on their Twitter and Facebook accounts. The United States and Cuba severed diplomatic relations in January of 1961, so it has been something over 54 years since there were normal diplomatic contacts between the two countries. But the two nations have been inching back toward normal relations over the past 6 or so years. This event is intended to be the start of a new post-Cold War relationship between the U.S. and Cuba, even as there are serious differences that remain, serious conflicts and potential conflicts between the nations, a number of which happily are actually, they're technical and legalistic. Which means they're amenable to negotiation rather than being ideological. Those ideological differences are always the ones that make it harder to improve relations. The bottom line here is that U.S. policy toward Cuba has been stupid and pointless, and it was long past time to get beyond the rigid mental straitjacket of Cold War thinking and recognize the world realities. So this reestablishing of embassies, yeah, this is good news. Which means, damn, I have to say for a second week in a row, congratulations to Barack Obama. The stars really must be in an odd configuration. All right, moving on from there. When the Supreme Court, or at least a majority of it, recognized that the fundamental right to marry should not be limited by the gender of the person you love any more than it should be limited by the race of the person you love, I celebrated that fact, but added that this did not mean that the battle for equal rights for LGBT, or if you prefer LGBTQ people, was by any means over. So I got a few notes on that front. In fact, the bigots are still searching for ways that they can discriminate and be bigots, and it turns out that the U.S. Senate, or at least a sufficient number of them, have got their backs. Just over a week ago, the Senate voted down the Student Non-Discrimination Act. This is intended to provide LGBTQ youth some protection against bullying in schools. The legislation actually got a majority of votes, including some from the Goppers, but the vote was 52 to 45, clearly short of the supermajority of 60 votes that every damn thing now needs to get passed because filibusters have become a normal part of Senate business. The bill would have established a mandate that public schools must refrain from and actively combat anti-LGBT discrimination in their schools. The bill also would have empowered LGBT students to seek help through the courts if they felt that they had been discriminated against, and of course we couldn't have any of that. Senator Al Franken, who has championed this measure for several years, noted the bill would simply take the protections that already exist, protections against discrimination and harassment that already exist based on factors such as gender, race, national origin, disability, and so on, and extend them to cover LGBT students. Quoting Franken on the need for this, quoting him, more than 30% of LGBT students report missing a day of school in the previous month because they felt unsafe. Nearly 75% of LGBT students say they've been verbally harassed at school, and more than 35% of LGBT students report being physically attacked. His words are given added weight by a recent report by the New York Civil Liberties Union, which is the state branch of the ACLU, which found that transgender students in that supposedly liberal state are facing high levels of discrimination and illegal treatment, including exclusion, segregation, and unconstitutional bias. And they found that this kind of treatment is very likely common across the United States. Still, opponents of Franklin's bill dismissed it as well-intentioned, but claimed it would lead to costly lawsuits, which is kind of odd, since those states, such as New York, which have adopted these kind of protections for LGBT youth, have not seen any kind of significant increase in those sorts of suits. Others said that LGBT students are already covered under Title IX, even though Title IX makes no mention of LGBT students, and besides, if they're already covered, what's the problem with actually saying so directly? Finally, it was argued that this is a local level, it's an educational issue, a local level issue. This is not a federal issue. An argument I will take as a sincere one when and only when those same people move to have discrimination based on, gender or race or whatever stripped away in order to be consistent and leave all the protections to those same jurisdictions which never did anything about them before. Meanwhile, on another front, speaking of local stuff, as we just were, there are, of course, still the county clerks who refuse to issue marriage licenses to same-sex couples, sometimes trying to cover themselves by refusing to issue any marriage licenses at all, but who, when you actually ask them, will cop to religious bigotry as the reason for their actions. Now, the rational response to this is to say that if you refuse to do your job, if you say that your religion, your religious beliefs keep you from doing your job, then you should quit. But that, again, is the rational response, which doesn't apply here because, like most right-wingers, these folks want to stand up for what they believe in as long as there is no personal consequences. They want to be able to refuse to do their jobs and still keep them. But for the right-wingers in Congress, that's small stuff. They're thinking big. In fact, they want to help every anti-LGBT bigot ignore laws and violate the human rights of LGBT people at no cost to themselves. Right-wingers in both houses of Congress are pushing a bill that would ban any federal-level discriminatory action, quoting, against a person wholly or partially on the basis that such person believes or acts in accordance with a religious belief or moral conviction that marriage is or should be recognized as the union of one man and one woman, or that sexual relations are properly reserved to such a marriage. In the bill, the term person is defined so broadly that it would include for-profit corporations. Discriminatory, by the way, means pretty much any change in pretty much anything related to federal tax status, contracts, benefits, employment, and more. Put another way, okay, some corporation decides God hates fags and fires an employee for marrying a same-sex partner, or some supposedly Christian organization turns away gay people from federally funded homeless shelters and drug programs. Under this bill, the feds wouldn't have to, in effect, just say, hey, that's cool, that's fine, go right ahead. This bill already has 130 co-sponsors in the House, and it's thought it will pass if it comes to a vote. Now, the prospects in the Senate are dimmer because of that 60-vote barrier, but that doesn't mean that these right-wingers won't push it as a means of their efforts to legitimize their vision of a Christian theocracy. Finally, for now, there's another reason to bring up this bill. Note the phrase in the bill, or that sexual relations are properly reserved to such a marriage. This bill would essentially empower any business anywhere in the country to fire anyone, anytime, for any kind of sex outside of marriage. In fact, outside of heterosexual marriage, and do it without any fear of any consequences. Some folks have been noting how this actually openly invites discrimination against unwed mothers, and yes, women do get fired for getting pregnant out of wedlock, but in fact, it clearly goes beyond that to cover any kind of sex at all. And this is not just a case of poor wording or not thinking through the meaning of what you're saying. Senator Mike Lee, who introduced the Senate version of the bill, was asked about a hypothetical university firing an unmarried woman for getting pregnant outside of marriage. He said, quoting him, "There are colleges and universities that have a religious belief that sexual relations are to be reserved for marriage, and he said they ought to be protected in their religious freedom." In other words, these people know exactly what they are saying. They know exactly the meaning of it. Just last week, in discussing a suit about insurance coverage of birth control, I said, "We told you years ago that they would not stop at abortion." You can't say you weren't warned that this sort of thing wasn't coming. Next up, before we have an RIP this week. Just a very brief one here, just to note the passing of Theodore Bikel. He died of natural causes at UCLA Medical Center in Los Angeles on July 21st. He was 91. Bikel was probably most famous for defining the role of Tevye the Milkman in Fiddler on the Roof, a role he played in over 2,200 performances. But his acting skill and his versatility with accents saw this native of Vienna, Austria, play, among others, a Dutch doctor, German army officers, a French general, Russian military man, and a Hungarian phonetics expert. And it was his role as a Southern sheriff in The Defiant Ones that got him an Oscar nomination. He appeared in movies on Broadway and in hundreds of TV shows. He was also an accomplished folk singer who recorded 37 albums, including some that were in multiple languages, including Ukrainian and Zulu. And something that's actually a little bit special to me, in 1959, he helped to found the Newport Folk Festival. So, R.I.P. Theodore Bikel. Now, here's a bit of news that should be filed under the heading, "Better late than never, oh wait, no it's not." The Cleveland Police Department has in effect admitted that it never should have hired Timothy Lehman, the failed cop who shot down 12-year-old Tamir Rice literally less than 2 seconds after pulling up to him in a squad car, then failed to offer any sort of aid as the child lay on the ground bleeding to death. The two supervisors who hired Lehman have been disciplined, found guilty of having failed to adequately supervise and review an applicant's background investigation and of administrative charges, including neglect of duty, which I'm sure brings complete closure to Tamir Rice's family. Lehman was hired in 2014 after he resigned from the Independence Police Department on his first day on the job. The police academy supervisor there wrote that Lehman's performance during handgun training was dismal and he had trouble following orders. He was then rejected by at least 5 other police departments before he was hired by the Cleveland Police Department by 2 supervisors who never checked with Independence. Lehman shot Tamir Rice on November 22nd. That is 7 months ago. And still Lehman has his job, and the investigation, and there is supposed to be one, drags on. In that time, we have learned that the Cleveland police lied through their teeth, told multiple lies about what happened that day. For one example, they claimed that Lehman told Tamir Rice 3 times to put up his hands before he fired, when the video, which the police actually did not know existed at the time they made that statement, clearly shows that there was no time for anybody to say anything 3 times. We also learned that investigators can't find any hard evidence that Lehman ever said any such thing. We have also learned in that time that a Cleveland Municipal Court judge found probable cause for Lehman to be charged with murder. And yet the case drags on, with prosecutor Timothy McGinty saying that he expects to present the case to a grand jury within months. Months on top of the 7 months that have already dragged by as Tamir Rice's family waits for justice. One last thing before the break. I have to say a quick happy birthday to The Nation, our country's oldest news magazine. This year it's celebrating its 150th anniversary. Its first issue was in July of 1865. The Nation was founded by abolitionists who were concerned for the welfare of newly freed slaves. But in a lot of ways, in those early years, it was also very right-wing. It was nativist, anti-labor, pro-corporate. Now, however, and for some time now, its editorial position could reasonably be described as being around the left end of the Democratic Party, which I will note also means it's a little to the right of me, but no matter. The Nation has not always been the same politically, but it has done what so many other sorts of political magazines have failed to do. It has persevered. And for that, if for nothing else, its birthday deserves note. So congratulations to The Nation, and we are taking a break. Now we're back, and it's time for one of our regular weekly features. It's called the Outrage of the Week. Since the tragic mass shooting in Chattanooga, there's been much talk about homegrown terrorism, almost all of which, of course, has focus on radical Islamic violence, as Dylan Roof gets flushed down the memory hole. A focus on Islamist violence maintained even though the Chattanooga murders have not been definitively labeled as terrorism, at least not yet. Not that the government, with the cooperation of the media, hasn't been trying to push the idea that it was terrorism, complete with an Islamist connection. Because the thing is, all terrorists, of course, even homegrown ones, are foreign-looking with foreign-sounding names. They're part of a global conspiracy intending to kill us all, while right-wing mass murderers are simply isolated wackos and troubled people. This is Mohammed Yusuf Abdulaziz. He's the Chattanooga shooter. This is our idea of what a terrorist looks like. This is not. However, that is a picture of Timothy McVeigh. You know, Oklahoma City, you remember. But I'm getting off my point here. The pundit class is all aflutter with the big question, what will we do? What can we do about these homegrown, of course, Islamic terrorists who are doubtless in our midst, even if we don't know who they are? Well, General Wesley Clark, the one-time golden boy of all good liberal Democrats, who for a time thought he would make a really great president, he has an answer. Lock them up and throw away the key before they have the chance to do anything to us. And not only us, our allied nations like Britain, France, and Germany, he said, should do the same thing. That's what he said on MSNBC on July 17th during a discussion about the Chattanooga shooting. Not just in those words, of course. I mean, he's much more elegant in his speech. He's more refined than that. But that is, in essence, what he said. And just to be clear, we're not talking here about people who have actually committed some crime, who have actually committed some act of terrorism. Because you don't have to actually do anything to wind up locked away in Clarkland. No, you just have to be considered disloyal. You just have to be radicalized. You just have to be described as not supporting the United States. We did it in World War II, he said. Someone supported Nazi Germany. We didn't say it was freedom of speech. We put them in a camp. They were prisoners of war. Of course, the World War II internment of Japanese Americans and to a lesser extent German Americans and Italian Americans is now regarded as one of the most shameful chapters in all of U.S. history. But it's a history Clark apparently is prepared to repeat, because he not only wants to intern, which actually means imprison, radicalized, disloyal Americans, remembering again that right-wing terrorists don't have to concern themselves here, they're not concerned, but he not only wants to imprison radicalized, disloyal Americans, he wants to, quote, identify the people who are most likely to be radicalized. We've got to cut this off at the beginning. In other words, not only does he want to imprison people, not for what they do, but for what they say or even for what they think, he may even want to include imprisoning people based on what the government thinks they may think in the future. Now, the fact that radicalization is a complex and amorphous process that we don't really understand, but a term which can serve a great political need, that complexity presents no issue for him. In fact, that very political malleability is useful to him in pushing this idea forward. In fact, to show the depth of his grasp of the concept of radicalization, Clark suggested that American Muslims could come to embrace radical Islam after losing a girlfriend, or if their family's not happy here. So yeah, it's sweep them up and lock them up. And as for the throwaway the key part, he said that the imprisonment should last for the duration of the conflict. And since we've already been told that the war on terrorism is a generations-long undertaking, the key would not only be thrown away, it would be landfilled. A life sentence in an internment camp for thinking disloyal thoughts. This is utterly nauseating. Later, Clark tried rather lamely to walk back some of what he said without actually taking any of it back, largely by the now stale trick of saying, well, I never said that particular word. For example, he tweeted that, never said Muslim internment or called for new camps. Well, General Clark, that's true. You never actually said the word internment. But what you did say, quoting, was that it's our right and obligation to segregate them from the normal community. And your press representative did say, oddly by way of defense of you, that, quote, there is a role for government to step in and prevent a dissenter from becoming an active shooter or worse. Yeah, and it's time to call in the precogs. The worst thing about all of this arises from the political principle known to some as Nixon goes to China. The idea there was that because Nixon was a foreign policy hawk, he could make an opening to China in the way a foreign policy dove or even moderate could not get away with politically. In the same way, Bill Clinton was able to push through his disastrous welfare reform in a way that a conservative president might not have been able to. And now we have the example of, hey, even the liberal Wesley Clark thinks we should start locking up people that we're suspicious about. If this had been said by one of the typical right-wing bozos, there'd be a lot of huffing and puffing, but it wouldn't be taken seriously as a current policy proposal. But because this comes from Wesley Clark, because this comes from someone so thoroughly establishment, because this comes from someone who's placed on the left side, the left half of the American political spectrum, the half that's expected to be more resistant to this idea, because of all that, Clark has given the idea of these think crimes a legitimacy that a Sean Hannity never could. And that is an outrage. We also have a footnote to the outrage, a footnote that, providing some perspective, demonstrates just how outrageous and ignorant Clark's proposal is. According to one set of statistics, in the years since 9/11, right-wing extremists have killed nearly twice as many people on American soil as domestic jihadists have. Over that time, 48 people died during deadly right-wing attacks, while 26 died during deadly jihadist attacks, according to a report by the New America Foundation. And the difference actually may be considerably more extreme. According to the New York Times, since 9/11, there's been an average of 6 terrorist plots a year that have been perpetrated by American Muslims, resulting in a total of 50 deaths. Meanwhile, according to the Combating Terrorism Center, a private think tank housed at West Point, between 2001 and 2012, right-wing attacks averaged about 30 a year, resulting in the deaths of 254 people, more than 5 times as many as were killed by jihadists. Different organizations come up with different numbers, largely because they define right-wing and jihadist and terrorism differently. But what they find over and over again is that the right wing is deadlier and a greater threat than jihadist terrorism. And in fact, the recent survey of 382 law enforcement agencies found that they were far more concerned about right-wing violence than about jihadist violence. Wesley Clark is not only an outrage, he's an ignorant buffoon. Okay. Last for this week, it's time for our other regular feature. It's the Clown Award, given as always for an act of meritorious stupidity. Now, you know, of course, about the video, the one made secretly showing Dr. Deborah Nucatola of Planned Parenthood discussing the transfer of tissue from aborted fetuses for use in medical research. She thought she was talking with representatives of a biogenics company, but they're actually anti-choice activists with the Center for Medical Progress, a bogus outfit headed by a serial offender named David Daladin, who's been trying to bring down Planned Parenthood for years, first with Operation Rescue and later with another outfit that posed bogus videos to accuse Planned Parenthood of all kinds of evils. 2 things about this new video became clear almost immediately. One is that it was part of a coordinated effort the release of it, that is, because at least 2 members of the grossly misnamed House Pro-Life Caucus admitted they saw this video weeks ago and kept silent about it until its formal release. When one of them, Tim Murphy, was asked about that, why he did that, he struggled for an answer and then said this interview didn't happen and left. The other thing became clear is that the cut-down version of the video initially released was deceitfully edited in a lying attempt to make it look like Planned Parenthood is making profits on the illegal sale of body parts. Deceit that became patently obvious when the full video was viewed. Simply put, there was nothing illegal, nothing unethical in those videos, and the right-wing anti-choice, anti-women's rights bozos are simply trying to use an ick factor about medical procedures to twist legal, ethical tissue donation into some evil scheme by Planned Parenthood to get rich. They are serially lying scum. So this week, the Clown Award goes to Planned Parenthood. Why? Because during the group's official response to the video, President Cecile Richards apologized for the tone of Dr. Nucatola's comments. No, you do not apologize when you have done nothing wrong. That is idiotic. And it only serves as the basis for legitimizing false accusations, as well as having the entirely predictable result that at least half the headlines didn't say Planned Parenthood rejects bogus video, it said Planned Parenthood apologizes. And Dr. Nucatola was not compassionate. She wasn't dealing with a client. She was dealing with medical professionals who would be used to that kind of language. There was nothing she said that was unethical or wrong, and in the context, the tone was entirely appropriate. Apologizing was a stupid and lame move, because unlike in boxing, there is no rope-a-dope in politics, and ducking and covering only means you're losing on points. What's required is a full-throated counterattack. Planned Parenthood's enemies are serial liars with roots in violent attempts to deny women health care through everything from blockades to bombings. And the failure of Planned Parenthood to label them as such and denounce them as such is foolish and self-defeating. So Planned Parenthood of America, you are an honorable organization doing honorable and valuable work. But this week, you are clowns. That's it. We're out of here. I'm out of time. We will see you next week. Have the best week you possibly can. Peace.